If you remember back to the previous segment, the Apollo 11 crew filmed 4 telecasts during the time that they were supposedly in cislunar space. And we know now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that they were claimed by NASA to have been filmed later than they actually were. The videos in question were filmed using a Westinghouse field sequential color camera. Westinghouse also supplied the camera that allegedly recorded Armstrong's step on the moon.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This camera was in black and white and is stored inside the descent structure of the LEM. The footage these respective cameras obtained were transmitted back to Earth using the S-band antennas mounted onto the service module and lunar module. In addition to the television cameras, Apollo 11 also took 2 16mm data acquisition cameras. One of these cameras was carried inside the command module. The other was mounted onto the inside of the LEM's triangular window. These cameras recorded views of the crew, the lunar surface, and more importantly, the undocking of the 2 craft, the lunar landing, the lunar EVA, the takeoff from the lunar surface, and the post-landing rendezvous. Remember, the videos recorded using the DACs were not broadcast live, but much like the Hasselblad still photos, the cameras were returned to Earth with the astronauts and viewed after splashdown. As one can imagine, man's first landing on another body in space was one of the most extensively recorded events in human history. All the TV networks picked up on it. Here is a clip from Michael Charlton's BBC coverage of the events prior to the moonwalk.
Spacecraft Mission Control Center. So we're in about 2 hours. The first pictures they expect should be coming in from space of Armstrong's spacewalk. It's been simply a tremendous afternoon here, as I'm sure it's been a great night for you all at home. We've seen something which Aldrin up there on the moon at this moment has invited us to contemplate each in his own way. We've seen this enormous technology of the Americans vindicate itself here this afternoon. We've seen the separation of the command module from the lunar module, like the separation of some primitive cell. And with that separation, the sowing of life, of human life, on our sister planet for the first time. We've seen something which Aldrin up there on the moon at this moment has invited us to contemplate each in his own way. We've seen this enormous technology of the Americans vindicate itself here this afternoon. We've seen the separation of the command module from the lunar module, like the separation of some primitive cell. We've seen the separation of the command module from the lunar module, like the separation of some primitive cell.
But how could that be so? The separation of the 2 craft was recorded using the data acquisition camera, which means it couldn't have been broadcast back to Earth. How did the BBC get a hold of this 16mm footage before it was returned to Earth? Even if the separation was recorded using the Westinghouse television camera, they still wouldn't have been able to receive it, as the separation took place on the far side of the moon.
Houston, Apollo 8, over. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus.
On Apollo 8, when the CSM supposedly orbited behind the moon, Houston Control lost contact with Borman, Louvre and Anders until they emerged from the far side of the moon.
Go ahead, Houston, Apollo 8. Very complete. Our orbit is...
On Apollo 11, the same thing allegedly happened. The reason is obvious. The television signals and communications cannot reach the radio telescopes on Earth with the moon in their line of sight. To recap, we know Houston lost Columbia's signal when its orbit allegedly took it behind the moon. And the BBC claims they received footage of the undocking.
This afternoon we've seen the separation of the command module from the lunar module, like the separation of some primitive cell.
How can this be when the separation of Columbia and Eagle took place on the far side of the moon? Even if they could get a signal, how did they get such footage when the undocking was filmed using the 16mm camera, not the Westinghouse TV camera hooked up to the S-band antenna? Unless, of course, the 16mm footage also went to air earlier than NASA wanted it to.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get the playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.